We're seeing amazing level of growth in the people who are reporting that they are child-free. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's growth in the actual number of people that are child-free, because it could just be that people are more comfortable reporting that they don't want to have children now, as the child-free lifestyle has become more acceptable.
Yeah.
And we can't really disentangle that, but we are seeing an increase in the numbers of people who are saying that they're child-free.
I'm Keltie Maguire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. You are in for a treat today, folks, because I have invited one of the top researchers on the child-free choice onto the podcast today. You are going to be hearing from Dr. Jennifer Watling Neal. And Jenna, as she goes by, is going to talk to us all about these different stereotypes of being child-free, whether it is in fact true that child-free people are miserable, whether we are selfish. We're going to be talking about the prevalence of being child-free. Are more people making this choice? We cover all kinds of ground, and I cannot wait for you to hear our conversation. Dr. Jennifer Watling Neal is a professor of psychology at Michigan State University. Her research uses large-scale demographic data to understand the prevalence, characteristics, and experiences of child-free adults in the United States and other countries. Jenna also researches social networks in educational contexts and has authored 90 peer-reviewed papers. Her work is published in scholarly journals such as Scientific Reports, Developmental Psychology, and American Journal of Community Psychology. She's been a guest on several past podcasts, including the American Psychological Association's Speaking of Psychology, hosted by Kim Mills, and the Overpopulation podcast, now called Overshoot, hosted by Nandita, Bajaj, and Ware. Hello, Jenna. Thank you so much for being here today. I feel really lucky that we get to have this conversation with you because at least my sense as a child-free by choice woman, and I know for a lot of the folks I work with who are on the fence, there seems to be, I guess, at least from my perspective, kind of a gaping black hole in terms of like, what do the lives of child-free people actually look like? How many people are choosing this choice? There are a lot of assumptions that we make about what it is to be child-free. And you are, at least from my view and the research I've done, one of the few people who've really delved into this topic of choosing child-free in adulthood. So, of course, I'm going to allow you to correct me if what I state is wrong, but I thank you for being here, and I'd love to just hear a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Thanks, Keltie. I'm really, really excited to be here on the Kids Are Child-Free podcast today, talking about some of my research. So I am a psychologist at Michigan State University. I started my research on a completely different topic. So most of my research has really focused on child and adolescent peer relations in school contexts. But more recently, within the past 5 years or so, I've become very interested in the population of child-free adults and really understanding the prevalence of child-free adults, so how many child-free adults are there out there, and also understanding the characteristics of child-free adults. So I'm super excited to talk about that recent research with you.
Okay. And I'm curious, would you agree, like, at least before starting to really delve into this, did you feel like there was a lack of information out there from where you stood? Or is that just me as like a non-academic type that it seems that way?
No, I really did feel like there was a bit of a lack of research out there on the topic. There actually were some pioneering researchers. So I should say, we definitely weren't the first set of researchers to come in and do work with this population. So I think about people like Amy Blackstone, who's at University of Maine, has an excellent book out there, and some other folks who were doing some really, really high quality qualitative work. So really delving into the experiences of child-free adults through interview data usually. So I'm getting kind of deep, in-depth pictures of child-free people's lives. But there was a lot less out there at the broader scale. So we were really interested in quantitative work focused on child-free adults and really understanding within the population how many are out there. And there was a lot less work on that topic when we first started.
Okay, interesting. And so are you then looking at data sets that already exist and like kind of mining it for information pertaining to this decision? Or, and I want to set this up because I know some people are also like, so is she talking to child-free people, or is this what she's seeing in numbers that you're getting from, I don't know, governments, or like where does this information come from that you work with?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. So our initial work, we started by collecting our own data it was actually through a survey that's run in Michigan called the State of the State Survey. And they run that survey multiple times a year, really on a representative sample of folks in Michigan. And researchers have the opportunity to add questions to the survey. And so in spring of 2020, we received some seed funding from the psychology department here at Michigan State for a pilot survey of all Michigan adults. And we put some questions on to try to identify child-free people and disentangle them from other types of non-parents and from parents. So that was our very first study, was in that spring 2020 State of the State survey. And we found that more than 1 in 4 people in the survey reported that they didn't want children, which was really pretty high. It was much higher than we expected and made us realize this could be a really large and interesting population to understand better. So we weren't sure if that initial survey that we added our questions to was a sort of an anomaly. So we ended up replicating our findings several more times using subsequent State of the State surveys in Michigan. And then after that, we sort of broadened our horizons a bit. And that's where we started really looking for those existing data sets that are already out there, where there might be questions that would allow us to disentangle child-free people from other types of non-parents. So we have looked at some US national samples and also some samples in other countries, including Japan, Philippines, and some developing countries as well.
Okay, that's interesting. And that's also, I'm sure, particularly of interest to some of our listeners, because we have quite an international mix. And so, I mean, for example, just speaking to the US, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard that the sort of demographic mix of Michigan is somewhat representative or reflective of the overall USA in terms of that demographic makeup. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So if you think about the state of Michigan, at the state level, we look pretty similar to the US in terms of things like race, political party affiliation, socioeconomic status. So our state sort of looks generally like the rest of the US. And so in some ways, it's a little bit good to generalize, but in other ways, there might be some unique aspects to Michigan. Okay. So we're now working with a new data set that's allowing us to look kind of state by state at prevalence of child-free people. And Michigan does seem to be on the higher side for states in terms of the number of child-free people that are out there. That is something we're kind of delving into right now.
Okay. And just for clarification, when you use the term child-free, shorthand for child-free by choice, we're implying that this is a decision that people have made, or are these people without kids, period?
That's a great question. So for us, child-free people, there's a very specific definition. These are people who aren't planning to have children, don't have children, and do not want them.
Okay, that's quite specific.
Yeah, so that differs from other types of non-parents, which are non-parents in general, people who just don't have kids. They're a pretty heterogeneous group. You've got folks who are what we would call not yet parents. Those are people who are planning to have children in the future. They know they want to have children, but just haven't had them. We've got a lot of folks who are undecided. These are people who aren't sure if they want to have children in the future. And it sounds like there might be a lot of listeners to your podcast who would fall in that category. And then you have people who are childless. These are people who really, really wanted to have children, but couldn't have them due to either medical circumstances or because they had social barriers. So this could be financial barriers. It could be a lack of a partner, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of different types of people that don't have kids, and they all have very different needs and priorities. And so we really wanted to be able to pull child-free adults apart from those other groups.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess the answer is probably in what you just shared, but when you think about differentiating these different groups, what I'm hearing is you believe it is important that we determine why or what those circumstances are, maybe not super specifically, but at least in terms of desire versus lack of desire around having kids. Do you think it's important that, I guess when we think about who might like to have this information, the answers are probably wide ranging, but like, can you delve a little bit more into why you think it's important to separate those groups out versus just saying these are all people without kids?
For me, it's that people who are child-free have very unique needs that aren't necessarily always addressed by policy, and they tend to kind of fly under the radar compared to some of the other groups. There's oftentimes a lot more focus on the people who are planning to have kids in the future, those not yet parents, which are the sort of biggest group of non-parents. That makes sense. But there's also a lot of focus on childless people, which is a much smaller group of non-parents. And child-free people, there's some things that are sort of unique about them. So when we think about like healthcare, for example, most of the conversations around reproductive care oftentimes focus on care for pregnant people or for people who are trying to become pregnant. So there's a lot of conversations about IVF, for example. These are really important things, but rarely do we talk about policies to address people who are actively trying to avoid getting pregnant, which would be the case for a child-free person. So things like access to and coverage for sterilization. Child-free people have unique work-life balance things going on. So oftentimes policies for work-life balance focus on caregiving relationships, especially parenting care for young children. And rarely focus on other aspects of life that should be balanced with work, which might include things like hobbies or pets or travel or those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point. I had a conversation with somebody on the podcast where we did talk about like, even just in general in like a work or corporate environment, if you will, when you think about the offerings that companies are making and the way they're trying to support their employees, even outside of like the job piece, it's often, we think about content for women in the workplace. It's often around being a mother and that work-life balance. And that can look and feel very different, of course, if you don't have kids. Okay, so tell us, what do we know? I mean, you mentioned that 25% number was what you had found in that first study that you'd explored or done. What percentage of people sort of fall into these categories? And has it been pretty consistent across the research you've done?
Yeah, so we've found that in general, child-free people tend to be the second largest group of non-parents, following only those not yet parents.
Interesting.
So in Michigan, we found that between 20 and 25% of Michigan adults are child-free. We've replicated that several times. So in May 2020, September 2021, April 2022, September 2022, and December 2022. So with multiple samples, we tried this over and over again to see, are we getting this consistent result? It seems high, but we were. And then nationwide, we used a survey called the National Survey for Family Growth. And that's data that's collected by the Center for Disease Control in the United States. It's collected via interviews. And the data set has the advantage that it's been collected for quite some time. So we can track back over the past 20 years or so with that data. In that data set, in 2002, we found that 14% of Americans ages 18 to 44 who didn't already have children were child-free. They didn't want to have children. But by 2022, that nearly doubled to around 30% of non-parents.
Big jump. That was some of your recent research, correct?
Yeah, that was recently published in the Journal of Marriage and Family.
Okay. And so to clarify then for people listening, because I know sometimes I make this mistake when I'm hearing these numbers. It's gone from, you said 14% was the first number?
Yes, 14%.
And the second number was?
30%.
Okay. And so that doesn't mean 30% of the total population doesn't have kids, but of the people without kids, 30% are clear they don't want them, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so, but does that then translate to, it's looking like there's been a growth then across the overall number, I'm guessing.
Yes. So we're seeing amazing level of growth in the people who are reporting that they are child-free. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's growth in the actual number of people that are child-free, because it could just be that people are more comfortable reporting that they don't want to have children now, as the child-free lifestyle has become more acceptable.
Yeah.
And we can't really disentangle that, but we are seeing an increase in the numbers of people who are saying that they're child-free.
Okay. And that was going to be my next question, is what do you attribute this growth to? Like, what do you think? I mean, we know some of the things that are happening that might be driving more people towards making this choice. One of the things you mentioned is just the acceptance piece of like, it's okay to say it, that I don't want kids versus, yeah, I couldn't have them, or nobody even asking.
Yeah, I do think over the last probably 20 years or so, we've seen an increasing acceptability of just saying, I don't want to have children. So I think back in 2013 or so, Time Magazine ran a cover on the child-free lifestyle, and we started to see the child-free lifestyle come into the mainstream media. And then I think on social media as well, there are a lot of influencers out there who are advocating a child-free lifestyle. So people are beginning to see, there are people out there who are living life without kids. They seem happy and satisfied. And I think there's a little bit less stigma attached to the child-free choice than there used to be, although there's still quite a lot of stigma attached to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, I mean, with all of this, it kind of probably depends where you stand, because I know for me, like, now having made this decision over the last several years to stay child-free, and then also working with people, of course, I'm very much immersed in this space. And I realize I'm kind of in a bubble where like, it feels like an explosion in growth with regards to the conversations that are being had, the accounts, and yet I talk to people who still say, I didn't even really recognize this was a choice until recently. And one thing that I'm guessing is coming to mind for people listening, and especially people who've made this, because I do have some people in the audience who've now chosen to be child-free. Where are all these people if like 25% of people are choosing not to have kids? Because I do hear time and again that I'm the only person I know who's made this choice, or I'm one of very few, or in my life I had zero examples. So like, I know that it's kind of a silly question. I don't expect you to know where they actually are, but why do you think people have that experience or feeling?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes hard to find child-free people out there in the world still, right? Because the majority of people still become parents. So most of the people we run into are going to have kids. And I also think sometimes people are probably a little reluctant to disclose that they are child-free still, even though it's becoming more acceptable. There's still a lot of stereotypes and stigma attached to being openly child-free. And so, your neighbor who doesn't have kids, you might not know if they're planning to have kids in the future, if they are childless, maybe they really wanted kids, or if they're child-free. And they might not disclose that to you right away because there's this stigma and stereotype associated with being child-free, being judged and called selfish and those kinds of things. So sometimes it can be difficult, even though there's quite a few child-free people out there, it can be difficult to find them.
Okay. What would you say when you look at, and I want to get more into like this particulars of like, who is this person who's choosing not to have kids? But just when we think about where people are living, is there a greater prevalence of people choosing this path, let's say in urban environments versus more like suburban or rural areas? Have you noticed anything like that?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that in too many studies. I'm trying to think if we had
or
that
like political
variable
affiliation or anything like that.
Yeah, so we have looked at political affiliation. So in some of our research, we found, in our Michigan research specifically, we found that child-free people tended to be slightly more liberal than parents, but it was a pretty small effect. So it wasn't like, child-free people are extremely liberal compared to parents. It was just a little bit more liberal. And interestingly enough, a lot of people sort of think there would be big personality differences between child-free people and parents. We've also looked at that a little bit in some of our Michigan data and really found very few personality differences.
Yeah.
Child-free people look pretty much the same as other parents or non-parents in terms of personality as well.
Yeah, I found that interesting. I'd actually read or seen that the other day, and like, I can't remember what they call it, but there's these different kind of key areas where they look at personality when doing psychological research, I understand. And that I think there was only, I can't remember what it was, but only one where there was like a really small difference, and everything else it's kind of like, yeah, introvert, extrovert, that's obviously a common one that people know, that there wasn't a difference. And I was actually personally a little bit surprised, but only because I think we can have that confirmation bias if we say, oh, I know all these child people, they all happen to be a certain way, but of course we're not actually, like, we don't have like the sample of parents necessarily to compare that against.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think we want to be able to say, oh, child-free people are unique in these ways, but the main way that they're unique is that they just don't want to have kids. They look very similar to parents on everything else.
Okay. Is there anything else like that has stood out that I'm like, give me something?
We have found that there are some demographic differences. So it sort of varies by where you're looking, but at least in the Michigan data, we found that more men are child-free than women.
Okay.
That more people who have always been, and this actually goes across multiple data sets, more people who've always been single are child-free than people who are married or partnered. And more people who identify as LGBTQ are child-free than those who don't. So there are some demographic differences in ways you might anticipate, but nothing really earth-shattering.
Yeah. For all of my heterosexual female listeners who think, no, men out there don't not want to have kids. I've had many women say to me, if they're single dating, like, I don't know if I'd ever be able to find a partner who doesn't want to have kids. There's this assumption, I'm not sure why, because I wouldn't say it's from my view that I would guess that, but there is this sense of like that men want kids, and that if you're a woman who doesn't want them and you're looking for a partner, that you wouldn't find that. But you've just proved us wrong. So there you go, ladies.
Yeah, there are quite a few child-free men out there.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm curious, you mentioned other countries like Japan, Philippines, you said some developing countries. What are we seeing in places like, I don't want to say like those, that's a lot of different places, but what are some other notable
so Japan's really interesting because they have had falling fertility rates, and their government is very concerned. So they have very detailed government data that tracks fertility, and using that data, they also had good questions about people's desires to have kids within that data. And so that allowed us to really look at over 250,000 Japanese adults. And we estimated with that data that over 5.5% of adults in Japan, about 2.5 million people, were child-free in 2020. And that percentage has been increasing since 2000. Okay. Now, in Japan, it's a little bit different because Japanese women are more likely to be child-free than men. So that's a difference from the United States data. But again, singles were more likely to be child-free and younger people.
Okay. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, and then Philippines is a case where there's a lot fewer child-free people in the Philippines. But we were able to look at data on over 120,000 just women. So that data set only included women, again, ages 15 to 49. And married women who are child-free, that's quite low. So it's been stable around 0.5%. So very few married women in the Philippines are child-free. But the percentage of single women who are child-free has doubled. So that doubled from 5% in the late 1990s to over 10% in 2022.
Okay, interesting. So if you're a woman in the Philippines, even if you're partnered, you're probably not going to want to get married if you don't want to have kids. I know it's not like one begets the other, but okay, once that marriage happens, then it sounds like it's almost a sure thing that children are in the future.
Coupled with having kids usually in my country.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Okay. And other developing countries, are these ones that you've studied, or is this just sort of data that you've seen or that's been made
So we are
available?
currently looking, this is using some data that was collected by USAID, and that data was collected in lots of developing countries. So we're currently looking at data in some sub-Saharan African countries and other places. And of course, the prevalence of child-free people is much lower in those countries, but there is variation. In some countries, there's more people who are child-free than others. So that's sort of ongoing new work that we are doing currently.
Okay, interesting. And so, I mean, globally speaking, then, would you say, you mentioned earlier, it might be tough to say, like, is there actual growth, or is it more that there's like a growth of people being willing to say, like, I've chosen this path? But is there an increase overall in terms of people choosing to be child-free, generally speaking?
We definitely are seeing an increase, and we can't disentangle whether that's because there's an actual increase or whether people are just more comfortable saying I'm child-free, where maybe previously they would have told people they were childless, just so that they didn't have the stigma. So we don't know for sure if it's an actual increase, but we definitely are seeing more and more people reporting being child-free, reporting not wanting to have kids.
Okay. You might have already answered this, but I had a few folks from our community who also have questions, as I mentioned, I would be speaking with sort of the preeminent researcher on this topic of being child-free. And that is if there is research about being child-free by choice in very pronatalist cultures, which probably do coincide with some of the countries you've mentioned. What do we see or know about more pronatalist cultures in this choice?
So a lot of the countries that we've done work in would be considered pronatal, like probably all of them actually be considered pronatalist.
US right now? Hello.
US, of course, Japan, Philippines all have expectations that, having children is a very positive thing, and that not having children, there's some stigma attached to that choice.
One thing I'm curious about, so a couple things actually. I want to go back to, you did say that, we do know about people who haven't decided yet, who are undecided. When I was on the fence, I felt like nobody's undecided. I'm the only one, right? Like everybody's so clear about what they want. It's just an inherent knowing. Of course, I've come to determine or find out that that's absolutely not the case. But what do we know about indecision? And would you be able to say for like an average, I mean, I don't expect you to have this exact number, but for, let's say, someone of 30 years of age, like how many people face indecision about this choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's definitely indecision, and I do think it's a very lonely place when you're undecided. I think for people who are in that space, sometimes it can feel like everybody knows. They either know that they want to have kids, or you've got some people who are really adamantly child-free and they say they've known since they were a teenager, right? And so the people who are undecided are like, why am I in this space where I don't know what I want to do? But we do know from our Michigan data that there were quite a few people that were in the undecided category. And the NSFG data, which is that national data set we've been working with more recently, the number of undecided people in that survey is very low. But I think the reason for that is because the data were collected via interview, and the interview questions really pressed people for whether they wanted to have kids or not. So if somebody said, I don't know, they had follow-up questions, which I think would eventually kind of route people kind of felt forced to make a choice. So I think there might have been some demand effects in that data. But the Michigan data was just sort of an anonymous survey, undecided 7.44%. So around 7%. Of folks reported being undecided.
Okay, and that was for all 18 plus adults in that sample, is that correct? Or amongst people who did not have kids? Yeah,
that was among the total adult population.
Okay, all right. Well, that's, again, we can look at the 93 plus% of people who I guess do have clarity, but 7% is still a fair number, I would say. Certainly not alone if you feel that way.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think that that is, of course, like a state where maybe it's a little bit more transient. So people kind of move through it. So when we collect our data, we're only taking like one snapshot, right? But then sometimes, somebody will make a decision and they'll decide they want to become a parent and they'll have a kid and then they move into the parent category. Some people decide they want to be child-free. They move into that category. So it's a little bit more transient than some of the other categories in our data.
Thank you for bringing it up. That's such a good point, because of course, if I was asked, I'd say, no, I'm decided I want to not have kids, or I don't want to have kids. But if you would have asked me at that point in time when I was undecided, of course, I would have been in that 7%. So, okay, interesting. I'm curious, do you have any information about or know like somebody's intentions versus actual outcomes? Because one of the things that we hear specifically about this child-free choice is you're going to change your mind. If you say you don't want to have kids, you will change it later. So is there a point at which it becomes more stable, let's say, that once someone's 35 or 40 years of age, that we can say with relative certainty they won't change their minds? Or, I'm not even sure if that's something you've explored, but it came to mind for me.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. And I really wish we had the data to be able to answer that question. So most of the data that we've looked at is sort of a snapshot in time. So it's just asking somebody at that point in time what their status is. And to really answer the question of whether a person's likely to remain child-free or to eventually have children, we would need to have longitudinal data that tracks the same people over time. So asking them the same questions over time. That data is really resource intensive and hard to collect. And so we don't really have a lot of those data sets out there to really do that kind of tracking in the way that we would want to. We have done a little bit that is more sort of retrospective, self-reported data about like when people decided to be child-free. And most people are reporting that they decided to be child-free in their teens and 20s, so pretty early on. But that's, of course, has all of the caveats that it's retrospective. It's relying on people's memories. So that longitudinal data would really be the best way to be able to track and kind of answer that question of how stable those decisions are.
Yeah, it would. I had mentioned to you before we started recording, and listeners might remember that we had Dr. Laura Buchinger on, and that's what they use are these long longitudinal data sets of like 60 plus years that they have through. I think the government here in Germany might be Europe wide, but I think it was Germany. But part of the problem with a lot of those longitudinal sets is they probably haven't asked these questions, right? So now we'd need to at least probably capture 10 to 15 years of that sort of childbearing age to say we can make certain conclusions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we do have some really great longitudinal panel data sets out there, but a lot of them don't ask the question of whether people want to have children, which is what you really need to distinguish child-free people from other types of non-parents.
So if you've been listening to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast, you might be thinking, wow, Keltie asks such good questions. Now, maybe you're not thinking that, but I have had multiple people say they really appreciate the questions that I ask the guests on the podcast. And if you would love for me to put my thinking cap on and to ask you thoughtful questions to help elicit connection with your own desires and help you figure out what it is you want when it comes to your kids or child-free decision, you're definitely going to want to check out my one-on-one coaching offers. I work with a select number of individuals each and every month to help them get clear on the choice that is right for them, whatever that may be. If you want details on how we can work together, you can head to kidsorchildfree.com. I will also link directly to the page where I have details on my one-on-one coaching work if you want to check that out. And if you're curious about how this all works and whether it's the right fit for you, you can also book a complimentary 30-minute call with me where we can talk about your unique situation, where you're struggling with this decision, and how I can help you in the form of one-on-one support. Okay, I want to delve into like stereotypes and myths around being child-free, because I think part of the reason, this decision is hard for a lot of reasons, and we're not going to speak today to the side of having kids, but everyone listening knows like all these things we're contending with if we're thinking about parenthood. If we're considering the child-free path, some of the most commonplace things we hear, of course, are you're going to regret your decision. It's selfish not having kids. Your life will be void of meaning, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm hoping that we can maybe delve into a few of these things, and you can let us know, like, what are you seeing in the research that you've done that can either support or deny what we're hearing. So
sounds good.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so the first one is like, you're going to be lonely if you don't have kids. For everyone just listening to audio and not watching the video, there was a bit of a face that Jenna just made. Yeah, that one. Do you hear that from people quite a bit?
Yes. Yeah, that's a very common thing that gets thrown out there, that you're going to be lonely, especially in old age, that, if you don't have children, you'll be all alone with your cats, right? So we haven't specifically looked at loneliness in our research, but we are currently examining how child-free people's social networks compare to parents. So the number of people they name as close others. So that's in a U.S. national data set that we're working with. And preliminary evidence suggests that child-free people may have smaller social networks than parents, particularly during that time when maybe, your 30s and 40s, where a lot of the other people around you might be parenting young children. So there's a potential that you could have a smaller social network, but not necessarily evidence of loneliness.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, I'm immediately thinking like quantity does not necessarily indicate quality, right? It could be you're in touch with a lot of people, but it might not be people you want to be in touch with, right? Okay. All right. So nothing specific to the loneliness. And for people listening, again, you can refer to that Dr. Laura Buchinger study, because I know there is some research there around loneliness specifically. But I always find it helpful, like, okay, what can we learn and know from all these different areas and studies? Okay. The next one is regret, which, people either, I'm scared I'm going to hate this and regret my decision, or that maybe I'll change my mind when it's too late. So what do we know about that?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. Child-free people, especially women, are often told that they're going to regret their decision later in life. There's very little evidence that actually happens. So in some of our work, we compared the amount of life regret that older parents and child-free people experience after the age of 70. And we observed no differences between the two groups. Older child-free people had no more life regret than older parents. So there doesn't seem to be evidence or support for having more regret if you make a child-free choice.
Okay. And when you ask about life regret, I'm guessing that could pertain to anything. Like, I wish I didn't work so much, so there's no way of knowing, like, one group has more regret around the childbearing or not decision.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So the question that we used was not a specific question. It was a more general question, sort of looking back over your life. Is there anything that you would change? So it would be really interesting to look specifically at regret around the decision to either be child-free or to have children. Parental regret is another area where we have very little data. It's very difficult to measure, but you can also think about regret the other way. There could be people that decide to have children and then regret that decision in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's something worth considering. And, it's funny because there's been a little bit of a swing in focus where I hear, yes, sure, maybe I'll regret not having kids, pardon me, but I hear probably from as many, if not more people, but what if I regret having them? Because I do think there's more discussion, more awareness around this topic of parental regret. But to your point, there still seems to be quite a lack of information there.
Yeah, it's very difficult to measure because
absolutely
it would be I think for a lot of participants, they'd feel very uncomfortable saying that they regret the decision to have children. There's such a taboo against that.
Totally. And I forget the term you use, but sort of this time sensitive nature piece that if you're asking somebody at one point in time, it's like you've got toddlers and things are really hectic. I mean, at what point is regret, quote, real regret? Is it looking back over your life? Is it in that moment you feel regretful? I agree that it's even the way they often ask the question, which I've talked about on the podcast with a couple of guests, of like, would you do things differently if you had the choice? I'm like, I guess that's regret, but not everyone would characterize even that as being regret, or more just, well, I'd probably explore something else. for fun. Okay, let's see. What's another stereotype or myth? That being child-free is a selfish choice.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most common stereotypes about child-free people, that they are selfish. But there's no evidence that child-free people are any more selfish than parents or other types of non-parents. And this is one a stereotype that we created a very brief stereotypes about child-free people measure.
Interesting.
And this was one of the things that we had on that measure. Because it's super common to assume that child-free people are more selfish than other people.
Okay. And you don't have to get into like all the ins and outs of the study, but were those questions asked of just people in general? Was it parents? And like, I'd be curious what other things were on there and what else was noticed.
Yeah. So in that study, we were really trying to develop a brief measure. So just a 4-item short stereotype measure. And we basically looked at that measure with a general sample, again, in Michigan. And we found that men, people without a college degree, and people who have or who wanted children tend to hold more negative views of child-free people than others.
Interesting. Is it surprising? I don't know. I'll let our listeners be the judge. Were you surprised by that outcome?
I wasn't terribly surprised. It seems like it would kind of hold.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Okay. And then, this probably goes hand in hand, perhaps to a degree, with selfishness, maybe not. But like, I know, for example, I've had people say, well, you've chosen not to have kids to focus on your career, or that assumption is being made, which for some people, yes, that becomes the focus, or they've made the choice for that reason. But it's not entirely the case, of course, for everyone. So do we see that career is a greater focus, of greater importance, that people put more time and energy into that if they don't have kids?
I don't think that's necessarily always the case. So I do think there are some people who are child-free that put a lot of focus on their career, but there are other people who don't. And it certainly isn't the most common reason that people give for being child-free.
Okay. And you've set up a next question for me, but I have one. I'm going to sandwich something else in before we ask the reasons why people have chosen to be child-free. And I want to talk about ideas of meaning and purpose. And that is one thing we often think or worry when we're on the fence or we're choosing this path is like, will my life be void of meaning? Or am I missing this really incredible, meaningful experience? What do we know about people who are choosing to be child-free and their sense of meaning and purpose in life?
Yeah, so we haven't looked specifically at sense of meaning, but we did look at life satisfaction more generally, which is related. In a 2021 study, we compared the life satisfaction of child-free adults to parents and other types of non-parents. And we found that child-free people report being just as satisfied with their lives as parents, childless people, or people who plan to have kids. So we didn't really find any statistical differences there.
Okay. Well, that's a big question for a lot of people, is effectively like, will I be satisfied with my life if I don't have kids? And it sounds like there's as much likelihood as if you did any of those other things.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, and when people are able to do what they want to do, they are satisfied with their life. And for some people, they really want to have kids, and that leads them to be satisfied with their lives if they have kids. For some people, they don't really have that desire to have children. They have other things that they want to do with their lives. And if they're able to do those other things, they're also satisfied with their lives.
Yeah. Okay. On the topic of other things, I'm not sure if, again, this is something that you've formally studied, or maybe as a researcher, you probably don't appreciate anecdotal evidence, but like another listener question that I had was like, what are some of the common ways that child-free people find purpose in their life outside of career? Because I think what I hear from a lot of people who are thinking about or have chosen that child-free path is, if I have a job or a career that's fine, or I like it, or maybe I hate it, is that okay? Do I have to have this great meaning in my work, or is there something else that can create meaning and purpose? So do we know anything about what's purposeful or meaningful for child-free people, or examples of those?
We haven't done that specific work, but I think there are folks who have done a little bit of work on that. I'm thinking some Amy Blackstone in her book, had some information about the types of activities that child-free people engage in to find meaning and purpose. Things like volunteering in their community. For some people, it might be things like travel or hobbies. So there's a lot of other things that people can do to get meaning and purpose in life beyond just the standards that we oftentimes think of career and family.
Yeah. I mean, I would say for everyone listening and for the person who's asked that question, what feels meaningful to you, and to be curious about that. I think we feel like we have to have some really like noble purpose, but meaning can be, I had a beautiful walk in the park today and a really nice conversation with a friend over coffee, and like that can feel meaningful. So I think it's more about looking within ourselves and really figuring out like what does it mean for me to live a purpose-filled life. And I know that's hard, but I would suggest it rather than viewing it as something that's thrust upon you from the outside that you have to somehow figure out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it, right? We have these societal norms that tell us we need to do these specific things to have meaning in our life, but oftentimes those things might not align with what would make us happy.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even somebody might hear, well, I don't really want to volunteer, or I don't know where I'd volunteer, or whatever the, the thought or suggestion is. And so looking back on, is there a time in your life where you felt like either an experience that felt meaningful to you, maybe getting curious about why that was, or a time in your life that felt specifically purposeful, and then being a little bit playful about how you can build some of those things into your life today. Something that you talked briefly about was like, okay, maybe we don't know specifically about meaning, but we do know about satisfaction. And so what do we know about the life satisfaction of people who choose not to have kids? Anything over and above what you shared with, like, it's just as likely to be satisfied as if you have kids, if you're undecided, et cetera?
Yeah. So, we really didn't find any differences at all. So I think if you're worried, I guess my take home message to people who might be undecided and trying to make the decision about whether to have kids, if they're worried, like, oh, if I decide not to have kids, I'm going to be really dissatisfied with life later. We didn't find any evidence of that. Basically, the life satisfaction of parents looks very similar to the life satisfaction of child-free people. So that wouldn't be something you'd want to be basing your decision on.
Okay, that makes sense. So funny, right? How we like feel the need to have to measure up one decision versus another, what one's going to make us happier. And I like the idea that many paths can make us happy, and it's about figuring out what's going to feel best to us. But I also think it's not a defined fate. It's the sense that we can choose to find happiness in whatever we choose, and also sometimes whatever happens, because it's not always within our control what these outcomes are with this decision, of course. So. Okay, so I have occasionally had people send me links to studies or little infographics, if you will, that they come across on Instagram that in my mind can be a little bit alarmist. They might have information that runs entirely contrary to what we've talked about today. Like, no, actually it's parents who are way happier than child-free people, or that a lot of child-free people do regret their choices. And I myself always try and be a little bit mindful and think through the kind of information and quote unquote research that I consume. And I'm just wondering if you maybe have any advice for listeners who read or see things that run, I guess, not to say that every information has to be like positive and make a great case for being child-free or for that matter, parents, but how can we be mindful consumers of the information and the studies and research that make it into headlines as we go through our lives, and specifically in the online space?
Yeah, I really love this question. There's a lot of misinformation out there in general, and a lot of also contradictory research. And science is pretty messy, and sometimes studies conflict with each other. So it can be really confusing out there if you're looking at these different studies and infographics that are coming in on Instagram or Bluesky. I probably tell your listeners what I would tell my psychology methods undergrad, which is I really recommend that if you see an infographic come across or a headline come across, to really take a closer look at where the statistics are coming from. Are they published in a reputable source? So like in a peer-reviewed journal, for example, are they coming from a reputable source like Pew? Can you tell what sample they came from? And is that sample representative? So is it representative of a specific population? So can we tell, like, is this representative of people in the US or people in a particular state or people in another country like Germany, right? That's going to be data that's probably a little bit more trustworthy than just a random survey on the internet where we don't know what the sample actually is. That can be kind of our first step, is to really just try to be a good consumer of the information that's coming in and make sure that you're looking at the source of the information and also looking a little bit at the method that was used to collect the data.
Okay, that's all really good advice. And I think, I don't want to act as though there's like these malicious forces out there. Of course, there are malicious forces out there in the world. But when it comes to these studies and data that's being shared, but I am mindful myself because I get, news alerts for topics like being child-free that, for example, a family values conservative publication is going to be more likely to sort of, claw onto or perhaps position certain data as it is good to have children. This is like, the big objective in life. And I think, similarly, if something's, let's say it's a child-free focused post or influence or whatever, like we basically want to serve our own individual agendas and also to reaffirm our own choices. And it's not to say that those things I think are explicitly wrong, but I always for myself think, okay, what else are they trying to communicate, or what's the sort of motive here in terms of them sharing this? Is that fair, do you think, or is that me being too suspicious?
No, I think that's extremely fair. Research is not always objectively done, right? A lot of research is done for these political purposes. And so being able to distinguish the source and be able to tell, like, is there sort of an advocacy angle to this? That's really important for being able to interpret what findings are being reported.
Okay, one question I want to go back to that I sort of lost my train of thought on is why people are choosing not to have kids. And have you done research around that? And do we know what would compel someone to choose not to have children? What are we hearing?
Yeah, so this is a great question. In our own research, we haven't asked people why they don't want to have children, but other research has examined that. The big one that I know about is there's a Pew survey out there where they asked people who don't want to have kids why they don't want to have kids, and the majority said that they just don't want to have children. So they didn't have a specific reason, they just didn't want to have kids. But there's also been some qualitative work out there where folks have really delved into the reasons people give for not wanting to have kids. And there's sort of a wide range of reasons that are given. That might include things like restrictions on freedom or career growth. It might include things like the high cost of having children, and it might include things like medical risks, restrictions on reproductive freedom. It's coming up more and more in the United States as we've seen more restrictions on reproductive freedom, climate change, political forces. So there's a lot of different reasons people might give, and not just one specific thing that comes up. If one specific thing did come up, it would be sort of a more of a non-reason that people just don't want to have kids.
So I'm glad that you say that, because I think that's something that has been largely overlooked. And that is the fact that a lot of people who choose this path is just because they simply don't want to. And that, for people listening, I just want you to know it's okay. You don't have to have some wonderful justification for not having kids. It can simply be that you have a lack of desire to have them. And yet there seems to be a lot of finger pointing at, well, it's because of this, it's because of that, it's because of this. And listen, I don't want to dismiss the factors that are putting, I think, specifically a lot of women in a real sort of pressure cooker, around, like you say, reproductive freedoms, climate change, of course, is a huge factor. These are all influences, I think, that are playing a role, and even having us question this decision of, do I want to have kids? And the assumption that that's just what we'll do. But I would say probably the most commonplace reason that I hear from people is, well, I don't know, it's just not really a desire that I have. And so would you agree that that seems to be overlooked? And why do you think that is, that we have to have like some sort of specific explanation?
Yeah, I do think it's overlooked. And it is the most common reason to just not want to have kids. But I think because most societies are very pronatal, that just kind of runs against those pronatal societies. And so when you try to say, I just don't want to have kids, people are like, but why? And they keep asking for reasons why. And you feel like you have to have some alternative thing to give people. But I would agree, you don't really need to do that. It's perfectly fine and normal to just not want to have kids.
Yeah. Well, and listen, I think that's something that can't be, quote, fixed as easily, right? Like if I just say, I simply don't want to have kids, there's no counter argument. There's no policy change. There's nothing that really can be done. And P.S., there needs to be a lot of, governmental policy changes. Like this is not, we need to worry about the climate. We need to be concerned with all these other forces that are playing into this decision. But that aside from, and we see this too, just trying to exert essentially force to say, you are wrong, this is bad, you must have children, which doesn't generally compel people. I shouldn't say that. I think it compels a lot of people, unfortunately, right? When we look at the overall societal attitudes towards being child-free, but I guess it's less tangible, right? It's a less easy fix.
Yeah, that's another good point, right? These other things, if you give that as a reason, somebody can come back to you and say, but what if we did this? Or what if we did that? But if you just say, I just don't want to have them, folks are kind of at a loss to come back with you for a reason that you should have kids.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, for me personally, like, for example, climate change was, I would say, a somewhat sizable concern or factor for me in making this decision. And yet, we can say, well, but Keltie, you take a plane and fly places, or you consume in all these other ways. And so I found I don't get people arguing or trying to, disagree with my decision very often. But if I do have someone who really pushes me on it, I find the easiest thing to do is effectively, give them nothing to grab onto. I just don't want them. Hard to argue that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, before we wrap things up, I just have a couple more questions. And that is for you personally, I'm wondering which aspects of your research you have found most surprising or most interesting.
Yeah, so I think the thing that was most surprising to me was the initial finding of how many child-free people we had in our Michigan samples. I thought there would be a decent number of people, but not as many. Being able to replicate that finding several times and also seeing some similar trends in U.S. national data, I've come to realize that child-free people are not some sort of fringe group. They are really pretty common. It's a pretty big group of people out there. And I think that, again, it's a group that's oftentimes overlooked or maybe thought of as a fringe group, but it's fairly normal.
Yeah. Okay. Last question is, what is next? What are you working on right now in your research, or where would you like to focus your energies where it concerns this child-free topic?
Yeah, so I am really excited. I mentioned earlier, we're currently analyzing data on child-free people's social networks. And in one of my other lines of work, I do social network analysis. And so I'm sort of connecting that line of work with the work I've been doing on child-free folks. And so I'm really excited to work with that data. And we think as child-free people get older and their friends have children, that could affect how they connect with others. So I'm really sort of excited to delve into that data and learn a little bit more about child-free people's networks and how those networks compare to parents' networks.
Okay, super interesting. Well, I hope you will keep me and us posted on all of that. Where can we find you, Jenna? Learn about your work and connect if there's questions we've got, et cetera.
Yeah, so we have a website, thechildfree.org. That has a bunch of information about our studies, and it also has resources for other research on the child-free choice. So that's a really good place if you want to learn more about our research, but also if you want to also find other research on the topic. And then I also have my own website is jennawneal.com. And there's some information about my child-free research on that website as well.
Okay, perfect. We will link to both those places as well as your social networks in case people want to follow you and the work that you're up to. I understand that there are ways that we can support, and I got to admit, I didn't look into like what this entails, if it's financial support or if it's a spreading the word kind of support. But if people think like this is really cool, I'm super happy that Jenna and her colleagues are doing this work to, find out more about child-free people. How can we support you?
Yeah, so on the childfree.org website, there is a link there if you would like to donate and make a tax-deductible donation to Michigan State University to support some of the research that we're doing. So that's available if you so choose, but you don't have to do that either. So,
of course you don't have to, but people, you have to. We've got to do it. No, I just, I think this podcast is reaching more and more people. I think it's so important to support the work of the people who come on here, whether it's a book they've written, whether it's research they're doing, whether it's a cause that they have. And so if you feel compelled, if you're like, this is amazing, we need to learn and discover more, no matter what side of the fence you fall on, I think it's just important that we understand more about people's life choices, drivers, desires. Like you say, this does have a trickle down or trickle back effect to policy changes and the way that we're supporting and helping different communities.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see more and more researchers in this space. So just in the short time that I've been doing this work, I've seen more and more people who are doing research specifically on child-free adults.
Yeah. Well, I know you did mention also Dr. Amy Blackstone in this conversation, and we'll make sure to link to her book. She's someone who's not come onto the podcast yet, but I would love to have her on in the future. So, well, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm really excited to see what you dig up and discover next.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right. You might have noticed in today's conversation that we did not talk about Jenna's kids or child-free decision. And that is by design. I always ask my guests, are you open to talking about your decision? And in this case, Jenna said, no, I don't generally like to talk about my choice because I'm a researcher. I want the emphasis to be on the research. I don't want people to be making conclusions or guesses, I should say, in terms of my own decision or life and how that may be impacting the work that I do. So fully respect that. You can guess. Do you think she's child-free? Do you think she has kids? It really doesn't matter because the work that she does is, statistically sound. Is that the right way of putting it? It is grounded in and founded in, all of this research and these different data sets that she's working with. And I'm just very excited to see what she and her team at the Michigan State University uncover next. So I thank her for doing this work, for coming onto the podcast, for all of you listening. Now, if you are listening and you're loving what you hear, and I know you are because I get so many lovely messages from you saying that this podcast has helped you make your decision, that it has made you feel seen, that you are binging the episodes, that you are loving and living for these conversations. If that's you and you have not already left a rating or review for the podcast, this is the best way to help us get discovered by new listeners. So if you can either go into the app that you're listening in, if you're on Spotify, you can very quickly leave a star rating on there for the podcast. Apple Podcasts gives you also the option, aside from a star rating, or in addition to, I should say, to also leave some kind words. So let us know what's resonating. Why are you listening and loving this podcast? It will go a long way, as mentioned, in helping us get discovered by more people on the fence so that we can help those people make decisions they can feel good about, whatever that decision may be. All right. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we will see you back here for our next episode next week.